Hi, I'm Peter Chan, National Weather Service Program Lead of the Alaska Weather Show, and I have a very important change notice to share with you. The last TV broadcast of the Alaska Weather Show in the traditional sense over the airwaves will be on Saturday, June 30th. Starting on July 1st and thereafter, the National Weather Service will provide a modified web-based version of the program on a new YouTube channel. So that means you'll be able to find us. We'll be moving from at AKwx TV to at NWS Alaska, and you can go ahead and subscribe to that channel now. There will be a public comment period from May 15th through July 30th, so please send your comments or concerns to nws.service-change-comments@noaa.gov. And if you have any other questions, you may reach carrie.haisley at noaa.gov and donald.moore at noaa.gov. Thank you for your patience and understanding.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks for being here for this Sunday's show. Up first, yesterday, as far as fire danger went for grass, you could see it was really non-existent up here over the northern interior. Some high areas here in the north side of the Alaska Range, western North Slope, and in the Copper River Basin. Taking a look at that today, it's expanded and much more widespread with a very high fire danger, again, in the areas north of the Alaska Range, all the Tanana Valley areas, part of the upper Yukon Valley off to the northeast along the Porcupine River, and kind of broken up here now over the North Slope, but increased areas of higher fire danger here over the southwest interior, and that's kind of laid back in the Copper River Basin a little bit there. And moving on to fire danger for spruce, again, high to very high, north of the Alaska Range into the Tanana Valley and northwest of the Denali Park area there. Otherwise, everywhere else, medium to mostly low, especially southern Alaska here in the North Gulf Coast, out into the southwest in the Alaska Peninsula. And for the hazardous weather graphic here, we're showing a continued flood watch for the streams draining in the southeastern Brooks Range. There up into, well, in that area and then extending down into the Koyukuk Valley, flood watch there as well, there along the Koyukuk River. And that's out through tomorrow afternoon, Monday afternoon. And for possible flooding due to the recent rains that's occurred there and snowmelt. Then a wind advisory out tonight through tomorrow afternoon for the eastern Alaska Range. And that's for those winds from the south-southeast, 20 to 30 miles an hour with gusts to 60 miles an hour. Again, strongest through the passes of the Alaska Range here. And again, that's out tonight through tomorrow afternoon. And from there, moving on to satellite imagery, you can see this rather strong front here for June, moving up into the southern interior, kind of breaking up all the precipitation falling out along the coastline with lighter amounts up over the inland areas and then back to the west and southwest here. And some good rainfall now moving into the eastern North Gulf Coast. Yakutat's picked up over 1/3 of an inch, and rain on the increase here over the northern central panhandle, coming down the south, or along, pushing southward along the coast as that band of moisture pushes in. Low pressure pulling back to the northwest here, keeping it cloudy and wet over the southeast Bering Sea, Pribilof Islands, Alaska Peninsula, and into Kodiak Island. Rainfall not as heavy and the winds not as strong as they were earlier on. And that's true up over the southwest interior areas. And some clear skies up over Kotzebue Sound into the North Slope. Temperatures in the North Slope rising into the 60s this afternoon. And mid-50s there for Kotzebue, for example. Buckland into the 60s as well. And rolling that again, you can see the low tracking northwestward there off the coast. Off the southwest coast near Cape Newenham there, and we'll see that moves going to start to stall out and then hang up along the southwest coast for tonight and tomorrow, begin to slowly weaken. On the chart, it's about this position here currently at about 986 millibars. Front pushing up and weakening as it moves inland, but brought pretty good rainfall and gusty winds. Inch of rain fell at Kodiak Island, while Seward picked up about 3/4 of an inch of rain. And let's see, Cordova had 1/2 inch, Then the heaviest amount at Portage, 3 inches of rain falling. These are all 24-hour amounts ending this afternoon. And Yakutat now has picked up at least 1/3 of an inch of rain on the increase here for the Panhandle as well. Also some pretty good winds. Homer had a wind gust earlier today up to 45 miles an hour. Palmer about 40 miles an hour. And King Salmon, 58-mile-per-hour winds there. And that strong southeast wind off the Alaska Range held the precipitation amounts down to about 1/100 of an inch, while areas along Bristol Bay, Togiak, Dillingham had anywhere from 1/4 to 2/3 or 1/3 of an inch of precipitation there. And again, windy and wet for the Alaska Peninsula. Isolated showers with troughs up over the northwest, but you can see dry conditions, some sunshine, again allowing that fire danger area to expand up over the interior north of the Alaska Range, and also due to the increasing gusty winds along the Alaska Range as well. For tonight, again, stays windy for the eastern Alaska Range. Again, those gusts 60 miles an hour tonight. Front pushes northward there, and maybe a band of precipitation going with it there up toward the Brooks Range. Showers back toward the Kallbuck-Selawik Valley areas, maybe Kotzebue. But pretty light precipitation amounts associated with this. Front pushes through the Panhandle this evening and tonight, actually this evening, and then after midnight becoming a little more showery conditions and starting to taper off a little bit. Otherwise, look for showers for the North Gulf Coast, South Central Alaska, Copper River Basin. Still periods of rain and breezy for the Kodiak Island area as well as the Alaska Peninsula. And this low right up to just south of Nunivak Island by about 3 a.m. tomorrow morning, Monday morning. Late tonight, showers over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. And then tomorrow, that kind of hangs up there right near St. Lawrence Island. I'm sorry, Nunivak Island, St. Lawrence Island, hardly any effect at all. Maybe some showers moving into Gamble. A little more in the way of shower activity for the Seward Peninsula. And actually, for Monday, pretty cloudy and showery with more of isolated, the scattered nature of the showers here over the eastern interior and wetter out to the west and especially to the southwest. But you can see a chance of showers even up to the north slope. And rain and showers, another trough moving up across Kodiak in toward the Kenai Peninsula. We'll look for some afternoon clearing for the southeast coast. And that'll translate into a dry day for Tuesday for the Panhandle with partly mostly sunny skies. In that area, an isolated shower or two around Yakutat and Dry Bay. Otherwise, showery, cloudy, cool over much of interior Alaska. Again, heaviest precipitation back to the west, lighter amounts to the east, and probably dry for the north slope, possible fog for the Arctic coast. Next system, increasing wind and precipitation over the northern Bering Sea through the Strait up to the northwest coast. Lows tonight in the 40s across southern Alaska, followed by highs. Upper 50s for the Copper River Basin, in the 50s for the Kuskokwim Valley, and 50s to lower 60s for the southeast coast. Lows in the 40s once again, and followed by highs, cooler 50s. Most areas, maybe a 61 down there toward Misty Fjords area, possibly Ketchikan, and up toward Skagway. Otherwise, everyone else in the 50s. Up to the north, lows tonight in the 40s, 30s for the Arctic coast and Bering Strait. Highs tomorrow. 60s, 50s, and 60s, with mid-60s for the North Slope area, 40s along the Arctic coast, some areas reaching the mid-50s at Dead Horse, and then lows mostly in the 30s and 40s, followed by highs in the 60s, lower to mid-60s now for the eastern interior, otherwise in the 50s, 40s and 50s from North Slope and the Arctic coast. Lows near 40 tonight for the Aleutians, highs tomorrow, 45 to 52, warmest around Unalaska. And then that'll be followed by lows, upper 30s to lower 40s again, but again on Alaska about 45, mid-40s also for the Alaska Peninsula, and that'll be followed by highs, upper 40s for the southwest coast, upper 40s to lower 50s elsewhere.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Well, tomorrow morning, lowest conditions will be found out here over the Bering Sea from the central Aleutians. Band of IFR extending up into the southwest interior there, right across Togiak Bay, Cape Newenham. Trying to push in the southern Kuskokwim Valley, just marginal VFR there, though. And then marginal VFR here across southern Alaska, south of the Alaska Range, north of the mountains, VFR from the Yukon Delta, right on up to the eastern and northeastern Brooks Range and North Slope, marginal VFR along the Arctic coast here down into the Bering Strait. And some IFR eastern coast range here on down across the southeast coast. And for the afternoon Monday, marginal VFR up into the Copper River Basin, Prince William Sound, into eastern Turnagain Arm, Resurrection Bay, VFR, Fognac Island, right up into Cook Inlet, and southeast coast, mostly VFR for the afternoon, as well as the interior, mostly VFR. So some IFR there for Togiak Bay on up across St. Matthew Island, just north of the Pribilofs, and for the Aleutians, mostly marginal VFR, same thing for the Bering Sea. And for the Tuesday morning time frame, not much difference. Another band of IFR sliding eastward there across the western Bering and Aleutians. Marginal VFR over the remainder of the Bering Sea, Alaska Peninsula, up into Kodiak Island. Southern Alaska here, mostly marginal, with some IFR, Bristol Bay along the southwest coast up into the Bering Strait. And marginal VFR along the Arctic coast with VFR in the central interior. And for the northern panhandle, marginal VFR, VFR to the south. And for Tuesday afternoon, look for marginal VFR over the central, northern, southeast coast with VFR southern panhandle. Again, this area of IFR here, Fognac Island up into southern Cook Inlet, so Kamishak Bay. Homer, Soldovia looking pretty good. For the afternoon Tuesday, marginal VFR elsewhere, especially here over a big chunk of the southwest interior. Better conditions off to the north and northeast with VFR there on into Canada. So some marginal VFR along the central and eastern Arctic coast. And for passes, Anatuvik, VFR trending toward marginal VFR. Same thing for Adigan Pass for the day Monday. Lake Clark on Merrill, marginal VFR at times. And for the Rainy Pass, same thing, marginal VFR, especially on the eastern entrance, all three passes there. For rainy or for windy, marginal VFR becoming VFR. And for Isabel, VFR, Mintasta, VFR. And for Tanita, VFR, Portage, marginal VFR. Chilcoot and White, marginal VFR, becoming VFR during the day. Freezing levels, coolest air still here over southern Alaska into the Gulf, about 4,000 feet, 3,000 to 4,000 feet over the Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. And then quite a gradient here across the Panhandle from 6,000 feet near Yakutat to, say, 10,000 feet there toward Ketchikan on into Misty Fjords area. Up to the north here, running about 6,000 to 8,000 feet. And from there, looking at icing, areas of isolated moderate rime or mixed icing possible anywhere here in the shaded areas. North Gulf Coast, back down to the southwest coast, right in over the state. Less of a threat there for the Panhandle. And icing free out here over the Aleutians and the Bering Sea, right up to St. Lawrence Island into the Chukchi Sea. North Slope, probably icing free as well as the Arctic coast. And the jet stream here, we've got the trough axis, several weak lows right through here. Southwest flow up to 65 knots on the south side of that trough and right across Kodiak into the Gulf. Lighter easterly flow there across the northern interior areas. But the Panhandle, good southwest flow, 95 knots. It's usually a wet weather pattern for them. And at 9,000 feet, southwest 40 knots here, just south of Kodiak Island, on up into the Gulf, and some 40 knots south-southwesterly winds over the central and southern interior, more westerly here for Bristol Bay, and then light out over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. 3,000 feet, west 45 knots coming around this low there, just east of Nunivak Island, into Bristol Bay, and then lighter winds from the southwest in the interior. Turbulence-wise, look for some mechanical light to isolated moderate turbulence there for the northern Panhandle, maybe the eastern Alaska Range area, Turnagain Arm, Manduska Valley, moderate turbulence here, southwest interior, Bristol Bay, and the Alaska Peninsula. Farther west, smooth, northern interior, pretty smooth as well.
That Galena flood back in 2013 was at the intersection of weather and climate. Rick, I often get questions about the difference between weather and climate. How do you distinguish between the two?
Well, that's a really good question, John. One of the analogies that I like to use, the wardrobe analogy. So in my closet, in my dresser, I've got clothes appropriate for 90-degree weather and 50 below weather. That's the climate part of my wardrobe. But what I'm going to put on today, am I going to wear my Hawaiian shirt because it's going to be a hot July day, or am I going to wear my bunny boots because it's going to be 50 below? That's the weather part of my wardrobe.
You know, there's another interesting analogy. I've heard it said that climate is like your personality, whereas weather is like the mood you're in today. It's like that old John Denver song. Some days are diamonds and some days are stones. That's how weather works.
Of course, it's really a continuous range. Just as the Galena ice jam flooding was the result of a weather event, that ice jam, up against that cold spring, a climate event. So too with less impactful events. For instance, a daily record high temperature is a weather event, one day's high. But we put that in a climate context, say comparing to a century or more of individual temperatures on a given date.
So these extreme events like record high temperatures also happen on the seasonal time scale. Just in the last few years, we've had what was called a marine heat wave in the waters south of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. With the water temperatures in that area set new records in 2015 and 2016.
And most Alaskans are acutely aware that big wildfire seasons are becoming more and more common, most recently in 2015, and the frequency of million-acre seasons has doubled since the early 1990s.
Just this past winter, we had another event in the Bering Sea. The ice extent in the Bering was lower than it had ever been in the last 150 years. That's about as far back as the good records go. There'd never been another year like this one in the Bering with so little sea ice. That had major impacts on the communities along the west coast and the northwest coast.
So, John, what have you been hearing from folks around town about these kind of climate extremes?
I've heard from a number of people who've been here a long time that winters just aren't what they used to be. The average temperatures are higher than they were back in the 1960s and 1970s, and we just don't get the extreme cold days, the days down in the minus 50s or even the minus 60s that we used to experience in Fairbanks back in the, say, the 1960s, 1970s, and even into the 1980s.
Well, and it's not just winter either. 2016 and 2017, the summers brought unusually muggy, humid weather to Fairbanks. We're not used to thinking of that in interior Alaska, but record high humidities during the summer months. As in the winter, we've had a significant increase in freezing rain events, since about 2000. So much so that DOT has changed their road treatment strategy, and now we have the school district building in winter rain days into the calendar. And of course, we all need good weather forecasts for these high-impact weather events.
We know, though, that weather forecasts are sometimes wrong just 3 or 4 days in advance. So if these weather forecasts and the models they're based on can't pick up events like freezing rain 3 or 4 days ahead, how can we believe what they say about climate for the future?
Well, that's a really good question, John. And I think the important thing to remember is that parts of the system are predictable.
So climate models can't give you weather for particular days or even for particular months or years. They actually predict averages. These are averages over periods of a decade or two, or even averages over periods of several years. So they don't give us the month-to-month information that we might want. What are they telling us about the future, though?
Well, these climate models are telling us on the decades-long time frames that warmer winters are going to become more common. We're going to have more frequent, very low sea ice years with late freeze up and early melt out. And the same will be true on Alaskan rivers. We'll have more frequent seasons when freeze up is late and break up is early.
One of the other common threads in these climate model predictions is that heavy rain events and heavy snow events will become more common in the future. That's actually a prediction that the models make for mid-latitudes as well as for high latitudes in areas like Alaska. So we can expect the heavy downpours to become heavier and the heavy winter snows to become heavier than we've been used to. They're also predicting more frequent freezing rain events, getting back to what you talked about earlier. These events that might have happened just once every year or two in the past could actually end up happening several times in a winter in the future, according to the climate models.
And it is important to remember that even in a warming world, there are still going to be seasons and years that are colder than the average, but these cold seasons will become less and less common. So, John, maybe I don't need to have those bunny boots in my closet anymore?
Well, at least you won't need to wear them as often as you did in the past.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Marine forecast, south coast, small craft advisories tomorrow, northwest winds 25 knots, seas 9 to 10 feet. Central coast, northwest at 20 with 9-foot seas. Lighter winds here on the north coast, out of the west 10 to 15 knots. And for Clarence Strait, northwesterlies at 15. Stevens Passage, variable to south winds at about 10. Lincoln Canal, southerlies at 20. And for the day Tuesday, no change over Lincoln Canal, still looking at a south wind at 20 knots. Northwest at 10 for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, northwest 15. And the south coast, not much change from tomorrow. For Tuesday, northwest 20 to 25 knots. Central coast, northwest at 20. And the light west-northwest breeze at 15 for the north coast. Prince William Sound, south wind 15 knots. North Gulf Coast, south to southwest winds 15 knots. Seas around 9 feet there. And for the Barren Islands, southerlies at 20 knots, 7-foot seas. Kamishak Bay, south winds at 20 knots there. And Cook Inlet, south winds 15 knots with 3 to 5-foot seas. And for the day on Tuesday, small craft advisories now for southern Cook Inlet for southwest winds 25 knots and 6-foot seas. Otherwise, north of the Forelands, south at 20, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, southwest at 20 knots with 4 to 6-foot seas. And for the central and western North Gulf Coast, southwest winds at 15. Eastern North Gulf Coast, variable 10 to 15 knots there. And for Prince William Sound, southeast winds at 10 knots with 2-foot seas. Kodiak Island for Monday, south winds 20 knots with seas 6 to 9 feet. And for the Alaska Peninsula, south to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots, seas around 6 feet. And Bristol Bay, south winds at 20 with 4-foot seas. And for Tuesday, Kodiak Island, southwesterlies at 20 to 25. Bristol Bay, southwest at 20. And the Alaska Peninsula looking at south to southwest winds about 15 knots. And seas not too bad, running 3 to 5 feet. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, southwest for the wind direction at 15 to 20 knots with 4 to 6-foot seas. Adak and Atka, all the way out to Shimei and Attu, light variable winds at 10 knots. Seas running 2 to 3 feet, or 2 to 4 feet. And for the day Tuesday, west to southwest winds at about 15 knots here for the western Aleutian areas. Adak and Atka, light variable winds at 10 knots. Unmak Island, light variable winds at 10 knots. On Alaska Island, looking at southerlies at 15 knots with 3 to 4 foot seas. For the Kuskokwim Delta coast, here south of Nunivak Island, south winds at 25 knots, 5 foot seas. Northeast at 15 for the Yukon Delta coast. East at 20 for Norton Sound. St. Lawrence Island, east winds at 10 knots. And for St. Matthew Island, northwesterlies at 20 knots, Pribilofs west at 20 knots with 6 foot seas. And for Tuesday, St. Paul, St. George Island, south winds at 15 knots, southwest at 30 knots for St. Matthew Island, Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound, all up through here. Pretty uniform on the winds and speeds and sea heights. Looking at southwesterly directions, wind speed 20 knots, sea heights 4 feet, and Kuskokwim Delta coast, southwest at 20 with 5 foot seas. Up to the north, eastern Beaufort Sea coast, easterlies 10 to 15 knots. Central coast about the same, out of the east at 15. Western Arctic coast, north winds 10 to 20 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea, north winds 10 to 15 knots. And for the day Tuesday, big increase in the winds here. Southerlies for the Chukchi Sea, anywhere from 30 to 35 knots. Seas, ice-free areas 6 to 7 feet. Western Arctic coast, small craft advisory, south winds 25 knots. West at 15 for the Central coast, eastern Beaufort Sea coast, west winds at 20 knots. And for tonight, again, low pressure continues to kind of pull north-northwest, or actually north from its current position here near Nunivak Island. That's going to keep it breezy and wet over the southwest interior. Same thing for the North Gulf Coast. Lots of showers, front pulling up, maybe a band of light rain along with it there up toward the Brooks Range. Rain changing to showers for the Panhandle. Tomorrow, stationary low there, slowly weakening, but keeps it wet and kind of breezy over the southwest interior. Showers all the way to the border and drying out over the Panhandle. And for the next day, sunshine for the southeast coast.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.